Hello people! As many Pokemon fans have surely come to notice, the mainline Pokemon games historically tend to focus on providing the player with a fun gameplay experience rather than building a 100% sound canon with consistent internal logic. This isn't to say that Pokemon games have bad stories, of course. These quote-unquote inconsistencies aren't really actual flaws of the game most of the time. I simply mean that Pokemon doesn't always make it a priority to clearly communicate how certain aspects of the gameplay experience translate to in-universe lore. I'm mostly pointing them out in this video for fun. An example of this would be how in the older games you can encounter NPCs that tell you to press the B button in order to run. Obviously, the player character isn't actually playing a game within the context of the story, so this dialogue is merely a non-canon interaction meant to help the player learn the game's mechanics. We can infer that this NPC isn't actually saying this to the player character canonically, and that the phrase has no bearing on the world building of the game. Or perhaps the running shoes really are activated by a button like in the Adventures manga. Confusingly though, not all examples of gameplay getting in the way of the lore are as clear-cut as with the running shoes. Sometimes it can be hard to tell if certain game mechanics actually exist in-universe, or if they're just there for you as the player to see and be able to play the game. One of the big ones is the very concept of levels. Levels are the main way difficulty is determined in Pokemon games. They're also tied to when Pokemon can learn moves or evolve. But do they actually exist for the characters in the game, or are they just something the player can see? I believe there's evidence that supports both options. There are NPCs that directly reference levels in their dialogue, which supports the idea that trainers in the Pokemon world are aware of their Pokemon's level, but the levels of the trainers and wild Pokemon you encounter don't always make total sense from a story and world building perspective. For instance, if the champion of a region is supposed to be the strongest trainer and they presumably traveled with and trained their Pokemon for years, then shouldn't their teams be level 100? Is level 100 an accomplishment above the skills of a champion that only the player characters can achieve? In a similar vein, why are post-game battles harder than the champion battle? It makes sense from a gameplay perspective since it wouldn't be fun for the difficulty to decrease in the post-game, but what implications does that have on the story? Are characters like Frontier Brain's DLC characters or the rivals you rematch canonically stronger than the previous champion because their teams are at a higher level? Or are these levels not canon and they only appear higher to you as the player to make the game more fun? When it comes to wild Pokemon, how come the weaker Pokemon only tend to live in early game areas and routes? What does that mean for the new trainers that start their journey in the towns and cities that the player only reaches at the end of the game? Does a trainer from, say, Sunyshore City battle the level 40 wild Pokemon from the adjacent Route 222 with their level 5 starter? Did they get stronger starters than Dawn or Lucas? And if so, how are they equipped to train them? Or maybe all the new trainers from all across Sinnoh need to go to Sangem Town to get their starters from Rowan and start their journey there. It makes sense for Dawn or Lucas since they're both from Twinleaf, which is really close to Sangem, but does every trainer really have to make their way all the way there regardless of where in Sinnoh they're from? As for legendaries, you could argue that some of them shouldn't be the level that they are when you encounter them. Shouldn't ancient Pokemon like the Weather and Creation trios be level 100 if they're so old? It's a little hard to believe that they just didn't battle all that much in all that time. All of these questions led me to suspect that levels either don't exist in-universe, or they do, but the levels you see when playing the game aren't always canon. If levels do exist canonically though, then how exactly can people determine their Pokemon's level? I have the same question about moves and HP. How are the characters aware of these traits that their Pokemon have? Is the Pokédex equipped with a special function that allows the trainer to see a Pokemon's stats and characteristics? That's sort of how it works in the anime, but you can still see levels in Legends Arceus where the Pokédex is just a scrapbook. Maybe, at the very least in that game, the characters are unaware of things like levels and moves and they just sort of guesstimate. On the topic of moves, how exactly can a trainer tell when a Pokemon is about to learn a new move, and how do they get to pick which move should be forgotten in its stead? Do the trainers just tell their Pokemon which move to forget? I think in the anime they sometimes show moves turning into stronger versions of themselves, like Ember becoming Flamethrower, but not every move a Pokemon learns has an obvious weaker equivalent that it can naturally replace. Okay, here's one that's been bugging me. What is up with the 6 Pokemon limit per battle? It makes sense to me that official battles like in gyms or at the Pokemon League allow trainers to use up to 6 Pokemon. That's just what the agreed format is. I also understand that the reason the average NPC doesn't use more than 6 may be because they're not seasoned trainers like the main character and might only have 2 or 3 Pokemon that they caught. But tell me, why do characters like evil team bosses stick to the rules? They're skilled trainers, right? So what's preventing them from just training 10 plus Pokemon and just keep throwing them at the player until they win? In the early anime, it is shown that when you catch a Pokemon with a full party, its Pokeball is automatically teleported to the PC, or in Ash's case, to Professor Oak. The manga explains that the reason trainers stick to a maximum of 6 Mons is because any more than that is too hard to properly take care of while journeying. But I find those explanations a little hard to accept in the game canon, especially for characters that aren't constantly on the road like the player is. Perhaps the most prominent gameplay aspect of Pokemon that doesn't quite make sense has to do with Pokemon eggs. Whenever a Pokemon hatches from an egg, it looks exactly the same as it will for the rest of its life, or until it evolves if we're talking about a mon that can do so. But that doesn't always add up. Everyone knows the famous example of Kangaskhan hatching with its baby already in its pouch, implying that they are siblings and not mother and child. But there's other Pokemon with similar problems, like Pokemon that hold some sort of object. Do newly born Farfetch'd really hatch already holding leeks? Do baby Tinkating hatch with their metal clubs already in their hands? This can probably be chalked up to the devs not wanting to make different models for these Pokemon that you can only see during the hatching animation, so it's not that big of a deal, but it leads me to a different but related issue. I again refer you to the Tinkating line. Notice how for every member of the species, their hammers look exactly the same at every evolutionary stage, even though they are allegedly made of scrap metal that the Pokemon is able to find. How come every Tinkating, Tinkatuff, and Tinkaton use the exact same pieces of metal to make the exact same designs for their weapons? The same question could be asked about Braixen or Hypno or any other Pokemon that holds an object, although in Tinkating's case, Pokemon Horizons at least shows us an example of the Pokemon fashioning a hammer from a different kind of metal. Oh, and a bonus question for y'all. How come these Mons can go back to their Pokeballs with their tools still in hand? I thought that only Pokemon can go inside a Pokeball. Does this mean that any matter can be shrunk or converted into energy to fit inside a Pokeball? Can a person go into a Pokeball? Lastly, I'd like to discuss colony-type Pokemon, as I like to call them. You know, Pokemon made up of multiple units. I'm not going to talk about whether or not it makes sense that they hatch from eggs together, because that can happen in the real world, but I am curious about how they interact with Pokeballs. Like, if one of the failings gets separated from the rest, and the trainer finds it and tries to catch it, will the other 5 also teleport to the Pokeball somehow, because they're technically all part of the same Pokemon? Or can you catch each of the 6 failings in separate Pokeballs? What if I already caught my failings and one of them gets lost? If I return the 5 I still have to their ball, what happens to the 6th? Can it then be caught by someone else, even though it already has an owner? Does the fact that I can fit 6 failings dudes into one ball mean that it's possible to fit multiple Pokemon into the same ball in other scenarios as well? Like, say, fit a Mantine and a Remoraid in the same Pokeball? This question applies to other Mons as well. Well, that's pretty much it for things that don't make sense in Pokemon. When I first came up with the idea for this video, I thought it could be an interesting discussion about suspension of disbelief in video games and how gameplay can have weird implications on the lore of a game. But when I started writing the script, it kind of devolved into me asking a bunch of questions and not really providing any answers. Still, I thought it could be a fun topic. Do you have any other questions like these that I didn't mention? And more importantly, do you have any headcanons that could explain away these inconsistencies? I'm kind of interested to find out. Thank you all for watching.